Obviously, the reason why I asked for this conversation is because of Minneapolis. And I would like to know, when you see what's happening there, and now I'm talking about the police event and the death of this man, is that business as usual? Is that something totally out of normal?
It certainly has a level of dependency about where you are and what agency you're in. So would something like this be normal for the FBI to do? No, not at all. They have training. They wouldn't do this. But for a regular municipal police department, I think this is way more common than than the typical observer would imagine. This happens to white people all the time. This happens to black people all the time. I kind of think that the knee on the neck is a very common position that cops take. I don't really know why. At least in Baltimore, we were trained not to do that, but it is really exceptionally commonplace. I think that's how Freddie Gray got killed in Baltimore. Is that what cops often come up and they drop their leg on the neck in that position, and they do it as like a pinning technique. It's effective, but I mean, why it's effective is because its level of force is way too high for that situation.
But if this is a common application of force, the policemen and women must learn it somewhere. Is it part of a curriculum? Is it in the book?
No.
No.
Most cops aren't really trained well. So where you have a lot of police things, they get it from like everybody else. We have this tendency to separate police from the rest of society, but they're not. They are a product of our society and something that we create. So a lot of cops get their ideas of policing from watching television, and it takes experience to get out of these things. And the training isn't really sufficient in most areas in America to give. Police generally have high school educations and stuff. You're not talking about somebody that the community actually invested to in order for them to perform well. This is the community as a whole. We ask people to do this and we set the level of training, and then when that goes wrong, we blame that person and miss the really big picture that we did this.
Can you tell me a little bit about a typical police training for a local police person?
Yeah, so Minneapolis is a smaller city, but at least in a city that size.
Well, Minneapolis has, I think, 400,000 or almost 500,000 people. It's not that small in the American context.
Well, that's at least mid-size, so that's a little bit bigger than Baltimore, but not much. So in an agency that size, you will have a professional attempt at an academy where somebody will be recruited, and then they'll go to the academy for about 6 months. And in that 6-month period, they're mostly learning really kind of the basics of the law, because they don't have any legal training. These are mostly high school graduated people. So they kind of give them the basics in the law. They spend a couple weeks learning how to shoot a gun, barely being able to shoot a gun, and kind of running through the basics. And then they go out onto the streets, and really you learn on the job. You don't really learn anything in the academy.
So there is no apprenticeship for a police person in the U.S.?
Well, they often have like what they'll call a field training officer program. But I talk about this in one of my books, that this is when you're in training, the trainers are telling you the right things to do. They're not telling you the wrong things to do. When you get to that apprenticeship is when they tell you, forget everything you learned at the academy. These are the streets. And it was one of my first days out on the street with a field training officer that I had him. A guy was on a bike and he hit the bike with his car, got out, threw the guy's shoes up onto the roof and threw the bike over into the backyard of another house. And that was that's the first time I ever seen anything like that. And that was my...
Sorry, that was too fast for me. Can you tell that again?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
So we were driving down the road and he yelled at somebody that was riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. The person, they had some kind of previous relationship that I didn't know of. So he then turns, hits the guy off the bike so that he falls off the bike, My field training officer gets out of the vehicle, goes up to the guy, yells at him, takes his shoes off, throws the guy's shoes up onto the roof of a building, then takes his bike and throws it over the fence of another side and tells him to leave. So that was my field training officer. That was my introduction to what the hell is going on.
What?
Yeah.
What?
That's I'm sure that is what I'm saying is way more commonplace. I mean, this is movies. You know, they even have this in movies where
is this legal to behave?
No.
To me, that sounds totally abusive.
Right, and so you're in pencil at that time. So even if you complained, do you think the cop that has a secure job or the officer that's a rookie and is going to get kicked out at a moment's notice? They have no right to. They can be fired at any moment. It's a probationary period for a year. So you're well entrenched in a year of the normal activities by the time you're an actual cop. I don't think this is going to be much different in Germany or anything. It's not going to be. It's just when you think there's a good police department, that department just masks things better than other ones.
Did you just say you believe that would be similar in Germany?
Yeah, it's going to be everywhere. Policing still has the same fundamental principle that justice is extracting revenge.
That seems to me very American.
Well, I mean, I understand that, but justice in Germany is for somebody committing murder is still that person going to prison. Revenge was sought, not the prevention of the next murder.
Well, okay. I disagree.
Because that's a core fundamental issue, though. So the fundamental problem with policing isn't all this race stuff that we get convoluted in. The key fundamental problem is that policing, as a general principle, is using greater violence to extract vengeance for a violation or a crime versus doing something that actually prevents the recurrence of that crime as an investigation as to why it happened. So no matter where you are, Germany, if the bank is robbed, the police come and they investigate the conditions of the robbery, put the people in prison, extract some kind of vengeance, and then they go about their day. Nothing is done to investigate the causations of why the people committed the murder and setting up societal conditions so that doesn't arise again.
Well, I guess that would be more the work of the Justice Department than the police department anyways, and of politicians and social workers.
Well, somebody would have to even investigate that, right? So I don't understand why. You're doing the same thing. You're only viewing police as the violent response, not the response that actually solves something. So if they were going to solve crime to prevent it, it would be a mass investigations into the causations of crime, what things cause crime. So through all my research, there are 4 things that cause crime, that are the strongest correlates to crime. And no police department anywhere in the United States is fighting that. There was one in like Stockholm that did it for a little bit.
What are these 4 causes that you consider?
Yeah, so the number one is environmental poisoning, highlighted by lead poisoning. I mean, you can just you can Google right now, lead poisoning violence correlate. It's approximately a 20-year delay from the time you poison a child. So the child is poisoned gets lead poisoning somewhere in the environment, and it affects their impulse control, it affects their violence response. And then 20 years later, when they're an adult male physically capable of actually doing something that registers to the police, then that's when you have violent crime. So in the 1974 CAFE standards in America, when they took away the lead out of the gasoline, you had a nationwide reduction in crime that was very dramatic, regardless of any policing or any societal conditions that were going on. This is true all over the world. The same thing happened in Europe very soon after. I don't know what your guys' standards were, but you did the very same thing. And crime plummeted in the 90s all over the world. And it's 20-year delay from lead poisoning. The only 2 countries that currently use leaded gasoline still are Yemen and Iraq. So let that settle in, as of how we even have violence is very likely to be terrorism is very related to environmental poisoning as well. The second strongest correlate is, let me pull up my list so I have it up there for you. I just want it up on my computer real quick to make sure I don't miss anything.
But I might be able to find these 4 points.
Okay, so the second thing is inequality.
Yeah.
So income inequality, resource inequality, and this is the thing that people often confuse with being poverty. Poverty is not remotely associated to crime at all. If anything, it's an inverse correlation to crime. What happens is when there's dramatic resource inequality right in front of one another. So in a place like Baltimore that has an elite class that's very rich and a poor class with almost no middle class, and it's real close to one another. So the very poor see the very rich live every day, and when that happens, you have an association with violence. So resource inequality, because there's a fight for those resources.
Yeah.
The third thing is local instability, and what I'll call on that is essentially this is things like fatherless homes, and something like riots going on in your neighborhood where there's just a government instability where you're kind of end up actually fighting for resources is the primary cause. But the core that we would look at is just when there's turmoil in a very small area, and in that area things can spike. The fourth thing is the actual police themselves, because they are the state's response as violence.
Yeah. Can you tell me something about police wages in this country? Does the policeman earn a good living here?
It varies dramatically. So you will hear a lot of stories about cops that make a ton of money. And in big cities, yeah, cops can be vastly overpaid for their level of skills and abilities. But the majority of policing, and in suburban and rural cops, these are very low income positions. In the counties, you're going to have ones that border on poverty in certain areas.
Can you give me some numbers? For instance,
yeah, sure. So I don't know if it'll correlate to you, but in West Virginia, in the suburbs somewhere in the middle of nowhere in a rural department, they're going to be making $28,000 to $32,000 a year. Being a police officer in a typical county, you might be looking at $40,000 to $60,000. In a city, you're going to be looking from anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000.
Is that the 60 to 100? Is that what you consider a very high or overpaid salary?
Most people would consider that overpaid for the skill level of these positions. This can be somebody that's a high school graduate that went to 6 months of school and has just done nothing but maintain their employment for 20 years, and they're making $100,000 to often be pencil pushers.
How come you became a policeman? I mean, you sounded as if you had much more than high school, and you have a doctor.
That was afterwards, though.
Sorry?
That was afterwards. So I grew up very poor in the suburbs of Baltimore, in and around the area. And as 17, I left to go into the Marine Corps as kind of one of the gross things about policing in the military and the American aspect is we essentially manipulate children to become mercenaries to allow them out of low income into the middle class. And I took that pathway. So I went to the Marine Corps. Then I came back and became a police officer. While I was a police officer, I did my bachelor's and I did my master's and doctorate after policing.
How long did you stay in the Marine Corps?
I did the Marine Corps for 4 years, from 17 to 21. Then I went into the police department, and as I was there for 11 years.
How, 11 years in the police department?
Yes.
Yeah. We are seeing now this major response to what has happened in Minneapolis. Out of your internal knowledge of the police in Baltimore, what will police people, it doesn't matter whether it's in Minneapolis or anywhere else in this country, what effect does this have on their minds? Will they be more careful the next time? Do they have serious discussions? Does this create hate or maybe something totally different?
There's always going to be exceptions because they're human beings, so they're going to have a variety, but I would think the vast majority are going to be more defensive and retreat more into the we have to be the more powerful upper hand and increase in militarization. And I think especially with the way the response has gone, that it pretty much assures us that the vast majority of the American population will also agree with a more aggressive police department to make sure these things don't happen. And I'm not talking about the death of George Floyd. More people are dying and being hurt. More Black lives are being injured and violated. And there's going to be for a very long time because of these riots. The community, the harm done to the Black community in Baltimore is or not in Baltimore, in America, is exponentially higher than what the harm of George Floyd's death is. There's just no question about that. A lot of media is not going to want to hit that topic.
So you believe that the harm that these rallies, these marches harm the Black community?
Yeah, absolutely, because
Also,
the conversation was almost dead as it was. The one thing I posted to be funny and pointed out is if you go to Google Trends and you search police reform as how many people are searching for police reform in America over the last 4 years, there's not enough data to even say. People aren't searching for solutions, and these riots and protests don't have anything to do with George Floyd. I don't believe at all. Maybe it's related to COVID, maybe it's related to income equality, maybe it's related to a weak young generation. I'm not really sure, but they don't have anything to do with policing, and they don't have anything to do with George Floyd's death. What they end up doing is when Black businesses are being destroyed, insurance rates goes up. When grocery stores are being burned down, Black residents in these communities can't get the medicines they need. They can't get the foods they get. They get re-entrenched into these problems as the cycle repeats over and over. And the vast majority of those citizens will want a more powerful policing to stop these people from taking away the very small resources that they already have.
so would you agree that there is a big deal of racism inside the police in this country?
No, I thought that at one point in time, and I never really argued that position, but I kind of assumed it was true. I traveled this country, went to pretty much all 50 states over the last 3 or 4 years and tried to talk to everybody. And I didn't find racism in this country. I don't think it really exists. It's fabricated. The police aren't racist either. The problem in policing is that policing, as its structure and its system that everyone in the community agrees to, has racist outcomes. Racist outcomes does not mean racist intent. Just like the 1974 crime bill that was pushed through by the Black leaders, they had the idea that this was going to help. They had a racist outcome by themselves, but they didn't have racist intent. The idea that cops have racist intent, for one, you never know someone else's intent. You're awfully glorifying your own abilities as a human being to think you can ever know someone else's intent. And it's probably ridiculous to think that we can know our own intent. We are creatures that respond to certain situations. And I don't think that to think that it's racism would be in Baltimore. I was a cop that had outcomes that were racist, but I wasn't racist, and I was listening to a Black police department with Black officers at my side, with a Black police commissioner, a Black state's attorney, a Black mayor, a Black city as a whole, a Black president, a Black attorney general. The idea that I'm the racist link is preposterous.
But racism by a police department would not necessarily mean that the police department itself is staffed by white people.
Right. So that's the thing. Then you're then saying that this Black police department is racist.
Well, yeah.
Right. So they have racist outcomes. The idea that all the Black people, I mean, if the definition of racism is Black people enforcing laws against Black people written by Black people, I think the term has lost meaning.
So, I mean, there are numbers that tell us that there is more violence than against Black people than against white people, if you take the parts of the population. And if I understood you correctly, in some of the interviews I listened to today that I found on the internet, you were also telling that when you were working in Baltimore, you made your numbers in Black neighborhoods, not in the white and wealthy neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, these things happen, but they're at the direction of Black people. So how that's racist, I can't find the connection. So that's what I'm saying. It has racist outcomes. That doesn't mean it's racist.
Is it maybe the word racist that disturbs you, and would you have a different reaction if I said bias?
Oh, sure. So all human beings have implicit bias, but the idea that that any observer knows which implicit bias was happening in the head of somebody else is I mean, it doesn't make sense. We're not psychic. So that's my problem. We have to focus on creating incentives and disincentives and improving the system, not trying to find blame in our opinions over someone else's human emotion. That's silly.
Well, I will go back again to something I heard you say about your own daughter and somebody's daughter who would be black. And you were saying
Nothing to
that
do
this
with race.
would not.
That's nothing to do with race. That has to do with class.
Okay.
Right.
Explain that difference.
So the thing there is that sure there are biases that people will assume, white or black, will assume that another black person is most likely in lower class, that they don't have resources. And there is a truth to that. It's not like that's fabricated. And then in a middle class neighborhood, so the same thing is true of my friend, my upper class thing. The same thing is true. I mean, Will Smith's kids aren't oppressed. That idea is nonsense. So it depends where you are in the class system. In America, the class system evolved from race and was really tied to race, but that has passed a long time ago. So you have a lot of things in the policies and in systems, but not in the culture. So when I say in systems, what I'm talking about is how these communities were formed and how they get locked into these cycles of riots and oppressions. These things had racist roots, but now they're not. It's not because of racism. Otherwise, you would be claiming that there's a food desert in Baltimore after the riots when they burned down all the grocery stores because of racist white people. That doesn't make any sense. Now, the reason that there are a lack of resources in that neighborhood and that grocery store is so important is from a racist history. It doesn't mean that is what is actively occurring, right? So if you're going the wrong way and then you go straight, you're still off course. Does that make sense?
I am trying to understand whether you
Right.
are
So do
telling
you
me
think Germans are still anti-Semitic?
Well, there are very few Jewish people living in Germany.
No. Is Germany as a whole still anti-Semitic?
I would say no.
I would say no as well. But you have a history that got you to a certain point. It's the exact same thing. It does not mean it's occurring today because there's still a legacy that is evolved in the culture.
So are you telling me that even though a totally disproportionate part of the people who
That's a lie.
killed,
That's not true. That's not true. So more white people are killed by the police, right? But you can't.
Okay, but there are more white people in the population.
I know, but you can't use that measure. That's an inaccurate measure. You would have to go by the instances of interactions. You can't go by the population when the vast majority of people that live in the rural areas and suburbs never interact with the police, black or white. They never interact with the police. Now, when 3% of we have to be honest. If we're ever going to go to reforms, we have to be honest. If 3% of the population is committing 50% of the murders, they're going to have vastly more interactions with the police. If you go by the amount of interactions with the police are dramatically less likely to shoot a black suspect. A Harvard study shows it. It's dramatic. And the other issue is, here's the other issue. Sorry, Dorothea. So the other issue is here's what we know about all violence, right? All violence is interfamiliar. This is true in your country. It's true any country you go to. So whites commit violence against whites, black commits violence against blacks, Germans commit violence against Germans, Protestants commit violence against Protestants. A queer person is vastly more likely to be beat up and have violence committed against them by another queer person than they are somebody else. If you're gay, it doesn't matter your category. You're more likely, vastly more likely to have a violent crime committed by your own type of person. So what that means, and there's no reason police are an exception, a white officer is vastly more likely to be aggressive with another white person. A black officer is vastly more aggressive to be aggressive towards another black person, and I observed that in front of me without question. I thought the black officers were way more aggressive towards black suspects than white officers were, and vice versa.
Well,
I was more aggressive with white people.
Are you also saying that when somebody like the police chief of Houston criticizes racism, or when Kaepernick takes the knee, or when policemen these days or demonstrators take a knee against racism in the police, that's beside the point?
No, I mean, I think they have good intent. I think they're seeing the outcome. So this is one of my problems when it comes to anything that is dealing with policing. So I'm not gonna act like I'm some elite of society in this aspect here. But because people had an interaction with police, they think they understand what is happening, and they don't. So you can see things and you can observe things that look a certain way, but unless you research them and you really understand what's going on, you don't know what's going on. And I think people will see these things and they have good intent, but they don't take the time to understand the system and understand what's really happening, nor do they care. I think they get into a narrative and it becomes very tribal about my team wants this, my team wants that, and it really becomes difficult for anyone like me to talk to the left or the right about how they need to change. They're just on these tribal teams and they don't really care about these issues, I don't think, at all.
Can you tell me a little bit about the daily routine of policemen? Maybe you take your own time when you were working in Baltimore.
I mean, sure. So typically you're thinking about a patrol officer. So when a patrol officer comes in, it gets up on his shift, and this could be a midnight shift or in the middle of the day. These things rotate. So you drive to work, you put on your gear, you put on your uniform if you don't already have it partially on, and you go to a little roll call meeting. They tell you what's going on in the neighborhood, brief you up on what's up to date. You walk outside, you get into a car, usually that someone else brings in, and you just flop and switch and go and take over the other role. And you go out and you start handling 911 calls. In that meeting, if crime is going up, then the only way police measure themselves is to arrest, and you will get pressured to go out there and make more arrests if the bosses aren't happy up your chain of command. And when that happens, you go out there and sure, you press a little things, and you have to step it up as you get these stats so that you get reviewed like any other employee does, and that's your metric. And you close out your shift hoping nothing happens, and you go home. That's what a cop does.
Can you tell me how these stats work?
Sure. So generally, I mean, I can speak obviously more specifically to Baltimore, but your judge, you have arrest. You have a felony arrest, which would be your number one stat. You have a misdemeanor arrest, which is going to be your number two stat. You have recovered guns, which are like a tie for 2, maybe 3, that you find in some way, shape, or form. And then really parking tickets, criminal citations, civil citations, things like that don't really count.
Don't really count?
No.
Uh-huh.
Like if somebody writes 20 traffic tickets and they came into work in Baltimore, they would be laughed at. That's not real work. There's violence in Baltimore, not traffic. The mayor's not concerned about traffic. The mayor's concerned about violence.
And if you make a good statistic, does that have any repercussion on your income?
Oh, well, I mean, they are tied. So the higher stats get into other units, get to specialized units. If I didn't arrest a lot of people, I would have never gotten into specialized units. So that's how you show your worth. This is how you're measured. So it shows that you're working and you're dedicated to your job. That's how it's basically seen. And it's also tied to income by like a way to make extra money is to just arrest somebody towards the end of your shift. Mm-hmm. And then you have to process all the paperwork and stuff.
So is there maybe a different police force that takes care of traffic infractions, or is there nobody who takes care of that?
Usually that's like state police and stuff like that go on the highways.
Yeah. So I heard you saying in some of your interviews that the main activity you had were because of guns and drugs.
Yeah, that's all that matters in Baltimore. I mean, that was even the the slogan of the police commissioner. The entire goal of the police department was bad guys with guns. It sounds like something from a movie. It sounds like something a 4-year-old would make. But that's what happens when you have a GED commissioner operating as the CEO of the biggest budget item in the city's finances. Do you see how ridiculous it is? I mean, we can't expect police to perform when we set them up with like no ability to actually do the job.
What qualifications should that person have, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, as long as we're talking about policing as violence, it's a big, long discussion, and I would push towards police eventually being just essentially SWAT teams that only handle emergency situations. Otherwise, they would be unarmed. But that's a very long discussion down the road. I think now all you can hope for is that you have police that somewhat serve their city and don't use excessive force, which I don't even know what excessive force is. See, another one of the problems with policing is we're all into these subjective terms. Isn't this better? Isn't this excessive? Is this appropriate? None of these terms actually mean anything.
That I find difficult to understand because there must be some measure for appropriate or adequate reaction. I mean,
Right.
if somebody,
So there's not.
if there is,
Yeah, I'll explain it. So my dissertation was actually on a study on this, and what it revealed is that there's a very core issue that probably exists in all of humanity, but it's pointed out in policing that there is a disagreement and no cohesion on where the source of morality comes from. So the law says that the use of deadly force for a police officer is from their individual ethics, their feelings about fear. They're doing what they thought was right. For me as a researcher, and what I think a lot of people would expect, is that the police follow the moral code that is created by the community, not their own. They're supposed to be employees who are serving that. But the law reflects that the police should be making individual ethical decisions, and a lot of policies and people's sayings are confusing where the source of ethical comes from when it's appropriate to whom. That's what I mean about subjective terms. If it's appropriate to the cop, that is a terrible system, and that's what we have codified, that a cop can use deadly force whenever they are in fear as deemed reasonable by not even another cop, the average cop. So what happens when the average or typical cop is completely inept? Then you have reasonableness defined directly as ineptness.
Is the word de-escalation part of the curriculum for police?
Absolutely. So what actually spawned my research project is that it was a study in England, and what happened is they started measuring the moral level. There's some kind of test that actually measures ethical behavior in a very reliable way. And so what they did is they measured people's ethical beliefs before they went into the police academy in England, and then when they got out. And despite the fact that the training they received is known in other environments to create more moral behavior by an employee, by the time the police in England left their academy, they had less morality than when they went in. And that is in England, which is remarkably better policing than what we have here in America. So if it's that bad there, what's it like here? So I wanted to say, why is this happening? How can we be giving people training that we know works, but yet the outcome is the exact opposite with policing? And that's what got me to the point. Investigating that question, it revealed this whole issue with the problem between communal ethics and individual ethics.
Are you trying to say that there is nothing that can be done?
I think it can, and I think there's a lot that can be done, but not on these national perspectives. I think that local communities, and that's the thing especially about America, is a local community can do absolutely whatever they want if they unite around it and they come together and have a goal. One of the last questions that Martin Luther King left us is will we choose chaos or will we choose community? And I think clearly right now chaos is being chosen. If you merely choose community and unite around your small area, not be on Twitter, not worry about what the media is telling you, actually care about your neighborhood, you can do whatever you want.
Now, if you were in Minneapolis right now and had a saying in the aftermath of this killing, what would you do? What would you change if ever you would change anything? Who would you fire? Who would you put in prison?
Yeah, see, I think that's all very much missing the point. So if I were there, I would tell everybody that we were doing exactly as they responded. This is one reason why I really don't buy these protests, because the officer was arrested. He's being charged with murder. The 4 cops were fired. And I think you're really sketchy territory firing the 2 cops that I never seen even look at him. So they've already done what they can do, but what the community is here asking, I need to make that plea that I tried to just starting this conversation, that justice is not getting vengeance on these people. If all you can think about is this person going to prison for the next 20 years, doing the job wrong that you asked them to do and then paid them to do and define their policies and training to do, you are very much missing the point. The whole focus that we need to switch on is long-term investments of local communities taking over their police departments, in which case there would be no point to riot anyway. You would have enough say in what the police department is doing. Now in America, policing is led by politicians. Politicians have 4 to 8 year terms. They use their police departments as a tool to say, oh, I got more arrests and I'm doing things like that. I'm doing this to stamp out crime, and their only way to stamp out crime is to put more people in prison. People go to prison, they come back out, and they're actually going to commit more crime because they're in a less of ability to take care of themselves than they were when they went in. But that's pushed down to another politician's problem. That mayor who did that is already gone and trying to ascend a higher political office. Policing must be tied to incentives that, or at least at minimal, include the lead poisoning, which is a 20-year incentive. The reason police departments aren't fighting lead as a causation of crime is because there is no system in the power structure to do so, because you're only talking about people with 4 to 8 year terms goals, and a community needs something much longer. So the system that I have set up that anyone can look at on my LinkedIn page is called civilian-led policing. But it's just a scientific approach to being able to get your stakeholders identified in your community, have them do little groups, and these little groups are able to formulate plans that come together as to one system. The issue is having a table for ideas. It's not focusing on the individual ideas, and the individual actions are a wrong way to go about making systemic changes. Systemic changes have to be about improving the process, not worrying about the outcomes. Good processes can have bad outcomes, and good outcomes can come from terrible processes.
Are you telling me that the police staff can be renewed with every new mayor?
That's almost essentially what happens. So every person above the civil service rank, so putting all this blame on what is really a police officer, is generally your 3 lower level cops. That's usually your officer and detectives, your sergeants, and your lieutenants. Every position after that is a political appointment that literally serves at the will of the mayor. And when there's political elections, a sheriff is literally running for office every 4 years. It's politics. It's not policing.
Mm-hmm. Is there anybody in the police in this country who are public servants and who have?
Oh yes. So of course there are. The thing is we get caught up in that.
Public servants public servants in the European sense, meaning that you have a life, a contract, a work contract for life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. Absolutely. That variety, the policing in America is not always on the same page. It's just going in the same direction. You will have areas that elect a sheriff. That's great. and they run by nice principles, and that could work for a little while, but that's never going to really be your answer if you're hoping for the right hero. I mean, relying on a hero is silly. You have to have a process. We can't hope for the benevolent dictator. We need to do the things ourselves. So yeah, it is possible for the right person to come in, but that change is very temporary, and it also creates a deep state kind of environment. In policing in Baltimore, we changed commissioners. Man, I probably had 9 in my 11 years. So when all those commissioners were changing, we never changed our behavior based upon the leader. We were the deep state supervisors. It didn't matter what happened in the political world. We could still continue doing whatever we wanted to do because we couldn't get fired. All we had to do was appease them, and we would still be able to run operations. If one cop would come in, if a commissioner would come in and try to say, to not arrest people or to use lower rioting techniques, this would very likely not be listened to on the street, because that commissioner won't have any authority when we know that the next mayor or the next commissioner is going to come in another year, and they might view things entirely differently. That's what a deep state really is, whether it's local or federal.
So my understanding of what is happening right now is pretty different from yours. You are the insider, of course, but I see that these arrests have been made after massive protests. In other cases,
why are you calling them protests? I mean, there is protesting, but these are riots. Like 16 people have been killed, and like 10 cops have been shot. This doesn't remotely resemble a protest. If it was a protest, it would care about solutions. This isn't a protest at all.
Well, I've spoken with people.
I know you've spoken with people, but this is not the street. The street doesn't talk like this. This is not drug dealers out on the street. Black men that run the streets in these poor neighborhoods, they're not weak. They're not out there seeing themselves as victims. These are middle-class white people and middle-class black people going to poor black neighborhoods and ruining them.
Yeah, and what is wrong about that?
Middle class and white black people going to black neighborhoods and burning them down.
Well, I don't know.
That's the KKK could never achieve what the far left achieves when it comes to racist outcomes. These black communities will have repercussions from this that go decades in insurance rates, not having grocery stores. New businesses won't come in because privileged people from counties came to cities to set them ablaze and ruin the lives of these people don't care about black lives. That is very clear.
Well, you know more than I can tell from what I see here in New York.
I mean, see what they're doing. They're killing black people in these cities, burning black children, destroying black businesses. This isn't about anything. If this was about solving policing issues, then they would have cared when Justine Barron was killed in that very same city doing the very same things. They would care as there was I can't remember his name, Timothy Dwight or something like that. There are videos all over the place of white people being killed in the exact same way as George Floyd. They don't care about policing. They don't. And they don't care about reform. They're not even Googling it.
Well, I get reform programs for the police. I hear it in New York. I hear it in Minneapolis. So that sounds very different from what you were saying.
You get things like, we want more black cops. There's no evidence that creates anything. They want things like no private prisons, like the name on the building matters.
Well, that's not exactly what I get, but it doesn't matter.
Think about that's what they think reform is, putting the government's name on the building instead of a community member's. That's nonsense.
Yeah. Okay. So basically you are telling me, because I've also heard you saying that nothing ever happens without an uprising.
An uprising, not riots.
Okay.
Martin Luther King,
there are riots. There is no doubt that there are riots these days, but there is also no doubt that there is an uprising in the sense. I see huge rallies
there
here
was
on the
an uprising. There was. And that's been ruined and overtaken by neoliberals and privileged white people from out in the counties coming into the cities and overtaking the message of these places. This is not these places' messages. These places want police that get rid of the violent element. That's what they want. Every single time I responded to a call, it was a black citizen asking me to come do something. This is not the message. This is the message of Twitter and the media. This is not the message of the black community. If we could just go, anyone can go on YouTube and search what the actual members of these communities are saying, and they want all of this to stop immediately. Because this doesn't have anything to do with policing. There's nothing. How can you even be protesting when the criminal justice system went after the killer? There's nothing to protest. I mean, that's what I want to know. That's what I think has ruined it. When we did this in Baltimore, it was we want these things. Now, 4 years later, there's no mission and no reason to protest. There was a reason to protest Freddie Gray being killed. The police were denying all accountability. In this situation, no one denies accountability. No one on the right wing thinks that George Floyd deserved this. No one on the left wing thinks this. No politicians thinks George Floyd did this. You're not hearing that message. And the state went after the killer. There's nothing to protest.
Okay, tell me, what are you doing?
I'm a little passionate about this subject. I'm not yelling at you. I'm yelling at the situation, you know?
Excuse me?
I'm not yelling at you. I'm yelling at the situation. You know what I'm saying? Like, it is extremely frustrating to see media and people that have known nothing about these communities come in and end up ruining them and then acting like they speak for them.
Okay, can you tell me what you are doing for a living right now that you no longer are a cop?
Whistleblowers don't get jobs. That's so far been the condition. So I finished my PhD and I write books and I publish what I can about the sciences of police management. That's the only thing I can do right now. I do videography with my wife and her photography business whenever we can, and that's about it. No one's really interested in this topic, I swear to you.
And you are not intending to go back to the police ever?
I mean, if Phoenix wanted me to do something, I would do it, but I can't. This isn't what the solution isn't me. The solution is communities overcoming it. Now, if a community wants me to help serve them and they're going to take charge, I will, but I'm not here to take charge. I'm not your benevolent dictator. I'm your scientist that helps you develop policy.